going to talk more about what journalists can do to create better media narratives around climate and environmental justice issues. We're also going to talk about the impact of disinformation and lobbyists has on media coverage. We have a really great panel, which I'd like to introduce right now. First, we have with us Evlando Cooper, a native New Orleanian, is a senior researcher for Media Matters for America. He works with the Climate and Energy Program, where he tracks a wide array of conservative and mainstream media coverage of climate and energy issues and identifies false and misleading media narratives that could undermine progress on climate change and environmental justice. He resides in Tacoma, Washington, where he's a member of the Sustainable Tacoma Commission. Welcome, Evlando. All right, next we have Susan Phillips, who's a senior reporter and editor covering climate, energy, and environment as part of the WHYY News Climate Desk. She is a founding member of the award-winning State Impact Pennsylvania website and a member of NPR's Energy and Environment coverage team. She has worked for a reporter for WHYY since 2004, covering politics, immigration, criminal justice, and education. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Meg McGuire, the founder and publisher of Delaware Currents. Meg has been a journalist for 30 years in New York and Connecticut. She started in weekly newspapers and moved to full-time work in dailies 25 years ago. She knows about the tectonic changes in journalism firsthand, having been part of what was euphemistically called a reduction in force in 2008. Now she's working to find new ways to do the news as an independent online publisher of news about the Delaware River, its watershed, and its people. Welcome, Meg.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, all of you, for joining me in this discussion. I'd love for each of you to go around and tell our participants a little bit about how you got started in researching or reporting on environmental and climate issues, and tell us about some of the stories that, or what's your focus that you currently do in your current position. Evlando, we'll start with you.
Hello, everybody. My name is Evlando Cooper. I'm very happy to be here. Looking forward to our discussion. Growing up, I think I was always kind of aware of climate and environment, but it wasn't until Hurricane Katrina, which displaced me and mostly everyone I know, that I really became of just how clear and present danger climate change was. And in the process of rebuilding my life after that, I started working with Media Matters, where I research climate and environmental issues as part of my everyday work. And I've seen firsthand how lack of knowledge on these issues or misinformation can be harmful in building the consensus we need for immediate and necessary climate action and for helping vulnerable communities deal with environmental pollution and environmental hazards. And what I'm seeing has been concerning, but conversations like these, I think, are an important part of the process of starting, of helping build consensus and helping bring more awareness to these issues. So again, I'm looking forward to it. Thank you.
Meg, would you like to share with us as well?
Oh, sure, thanks. As you mentioned in the intro, I had been what I would call a regular journalist in a legacy newsroom. My last job in a legacy newsroom was as managing editor of a newspaper called the Times Herald Record, based in Middletown, New York. When I was let go, I did some teaching, but wanted very much to stay in the journalism universe and thought, since I'm pretty close to the Delaware River, maybe I could do some freelance stories. That's when it occurred to me, or it became evident to me, that there is a dearth of environmental reporters that spreads through the whole country. When newspapers, especially news sites generally, went through the period of downsizing, I was one of the downsized, one of the places that they looked to take this voice away from newsrooms was the environmental reporting aspect. And I think back 10 years and more ago, a lot of the environmental coverage was not specifically local. We didn't have the passion to understand the impacts of climate change on individual communities and individuals. We have learned that in the last 10 years. But in the meantime, a lot of those environmental journalists have been let go. So now a lot of the environmental journalists that are doing great reporting on the environment are freelancers. There are fewer and fewer people like Susan, who has an enormous breadth of experience, who are actually operating in a legacy newsroom that supports that work and gives that information in a very smart way back to its community. If you look at the watershed, which is what I cover, which is the areas of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware within the watershed of the Delaware River, there are only a handful of what I would call full-time environmental journalists, and there are a good handful of freelancers. But connecting those freelancers, especially to communities that are overburdened, and probably one of our speakers talked about people that have day jobs, who have, multiple jobs. Finding ways to connect that enormous resource of smarts and talent to the people who need it is a big problem. And I think the journalists who are working in the field of environmental journalism are eager to make that connection. But we don't have the vehicles that we had before because so many media sites have been downsized.
I see some folks nodding in agreement. Susan, tell us how you got started in this field and what you've been working on.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. And apologize for my camera. I was trying to fix it earlier. I don't know what's going on. But anyway, um, yeah, so I didn't start out as an environmental journalist. I sort of fell into it because I started covering the Marcellus Shale boom, which nobody else, not many people were covering. I mean, there was like a few like local journalists for sure who were covering it at different papers throughout the state, but um, I was lucky enough, as I said, I'm in a legacy newsroom, but it's a public radio legacy newsroom. So I was lucky enough to sort of ride the wave of like all of a sudden, um, a lot of foundations and grant makers realized, oh, there's nobody covering the environment. We better give some grants to public radio to do so. So that's sort of how I kind of launched my shift to environmental coverage, was covering fracking in Pennsylvania. And at this point, nobody in our newsroom had been covering the environment before then. There was no environmental reporter. But the fact that you get this kind of chunk of money allows reporters to focus on that, right? And now we have 3 environmental reporters in our newsroom, which is pretty shocking. It's not a huge newsroom, to be honest. But I will say, like a lot of the support for that kind of coverage is through the nonprofit kind of foundation grant making sector right now, right? And that's been really, really helpful for us. So yeah, so that's how I got my start, was through fracking, and it was just sort of one story after another, where I didn't know anything. At first I was like, oh, I guess this is a business story, right? And then I went out into the communities in rural Pennsylvania um that were impacted, and I found like one story after another of sort of environmental impacts, health impacts from fracking. And so that was my entryway. And then I started covering, and it's funny you mentioned Hurricane Katrina, because like it occurred to me that like I covered that in Philadelphia. This is before I was an environmental reporter, but I was covering all the folks who were moving here or being transferred here. Like they didn't even know where they were. They're like, where am I? I'm like, you're in North Philly now. Like it was so weird and chaotic, and I was covering that, and it didn't occur to me at the time that this was a climate story, right? And that so many years later I'd be a climate reporter. you know but yeah, that was kind of I could see how that was my intro to that. So yeah, and then I kind of shifted to climate because that got more and more prescient, really. And it's connected. I mean, it's connected to fossil fuels and everything else, and it's connected to everything, really, at this point. It's like everything story. So and in our newsroom, I mean, we have, I help lead the climate desk, and what I do here is try to encourage everybody every other beat reporter to do climate stories. I mean, I kind of have to because I can't do it all. It's like almost every day there's like another climate story. So like, whether you cover business or transportation or New Jersey, actually, the New Jersey reporter, the suburban reporter has done both of like those folks have done a lot of really good environmental and climate coverage for us.
Thank you for sharing. And it's interesting that, the two of you did not get started as, quote unquote, environmental or climate reporters, because there's a lot of people on this webinar today who are part of new newsrooms or startups, and they're maybe looking to cover climate stories. And so I just want to demonstrate that you don't necessarily have to be an expert. Certainly you should consult experts in your story, but, we want to encourage you to explore some of these topics, even if you're just only doing a few stories a month, and then, be able to seek out funding, as you said, Susan, to support people doing this full time. There's certainly a need for that. And if people ask, like, well, what's Free Press's interest in this in terms of media policy and advocacy? Well, I became especially interested in this by joining, and I'm Puerto Rican, after Hurricane Maria. The island was devastated. But, when it comes to media and telecommunications policy, the communications infrastructure was decimated after the storm, and it still hasn't been fully rebuilt. And so I think that's when we started looking, at climate coverage more so, and comparing, reconstruction to areas that received more coverage, right? So there's like a lot of coverage initially, and then it dropped off. There certainly weren't covering it long term, but there is a relationship there between the amount of coverage a community receives and how much is invested in them in reconstruction and resources. And so that is something that we're still looking at in terms of, all of these areas that experience power failures, like we seeing more recently in Texas with the electrical grid. All of these things are also connected to emergency communications infrastructure. And we certainly looked at that in the last couple of years with the wildfires. So I want to move on to our next question, which is, for everyone in this group, how do you think journalism and climate and environmental issues has changed in the last few years? What are you seeing in your own work or your own newsroom? Meg, we'll start with you since you've been doing it the longest.
I don't know. I think Susan might have me beat. But anyway, what I wanted to say in reference to a previous comment, um, our attention as a nation very often is on legacy newsrooms. For example, in the watershed, I cover all of the land that the Delaware River draws its water from in order to slake the thirst of more than 14 million people. That includes cities like Easton, Philadelphia, Camden, and Wilmington, each of them having EJ communities within them. But one of the things that we sort of, I think, overlook is the incredibly importance of ethnic and community media. Those are the people that now have the ear of their communities in a way that is going to be really hard for even astute reporting like Susan's or like the New York Times. It's hard to bridge that gap, especially for people that are running two jobs and blah, blah, blah. But if there's a local paper that they check what the school lunches are, or they check what the bus routes are, or they check those things that are vital to their life right now, right? Those are the places that I think are almost the best instruments for getting this information across. And rather than each one have its own environmental reporter, this is where I think the Center for Cooperative Media is great for this. Collaboratives. How can like a body of papers or a body of news sites somehow get together and have one or two freelance reporters that they each share equally in whatever the cost of that reporter is, so that you can start getting there is so much good writing and so much intelligence now available in the media universe about climate. But does it actually get to the hands of the people who desperately need it? Maybe not, because maybe they don't have a subscription to the New York Times. They may not listen to WHYY, more's the pity. But it's like getting to the people where they live. And for the people on this call, you clearly know of the value of the Center of Cooperative Media because that's one of the places that they're really emphasizing to help people understand that it's a sort of a community grassroots effort together, that it is together that we would find the solution. Sorry, I just had to go on about that.
Thank you. No, it's so true. And I recognize a lot of the names on this call of people representing ethnic and community. I mean, we certainly experienced that recently in South Jersey and Philadelphia when they dumped thousands of gallons of latex water or latex into the water.
Mhm.
And being someone who's very much involved with the Latino Spanish speaking media, there really was little to no information coming from local government. And so it was really our job to try to get that information quickly to people and not just news stories, but on group chats and text messages and Facebook groups. So using whatever mechanism we could think of to get out that communication. And to your point, if we did not have those coalitions and networks in place, it would have been much harder to get that information in Spanish to those folks. Evlando, tell us a little bit about the research that you've been doing and how has the media coverage changed, if it has? We're in election year. If you talk to a lot of young voters, they'll tell you that the climate is a really big issue that they're concerned about. That's not always reflected, especially in the last couple of weeks, right? In elections coverage. Tell us a little bit about what you've been seeing.
Sure. Just speaking towards print online, I mean, I think outside of the kind of challenging environment for that particular type of news media, they've done an excellent job reporting on climate and environment. Um, Looking specifically at the broadcast networks, which is where a lot of our studies go, and cable, they haven't been. I mean, we've seen some improvements in the quality and quantity. We've seen more climate scientists, experts being brought on to discuss climate change, extreme weather, and doing some in-depth reporting. But our analysis shows a concerning trend with regard to broadcast networks. After 2 years of historically high coverage in 2021 and 2022, we saw a 25% decrease in climate coverage in 2023, a year of record extreme weather impacts. And it's important to note, even at its peak, when we were lauding them for doing a good job, climate coverage only accounted for about 1% of total broadcast news coverage. So there's a huge uh, opportunity for them to improve, at minimum, the quantity of coverage. With regards to quality, it's even more dire for an issue like environmental justice, right? And part of what we see kind of a siloing of climate change and environmental justice. For instance, with regards to climate change, we have numerous extreme weather events happening across the country. Yet they still cover them as discrete events. They're not showing that they're connected through global warming, which is caused by the burning of fossil fuels. That's not language you see very consistently in reporting of extreme weather. With regards to environmental justice, we had to create a methodology to really try to capture how they're talking about it. And what we've determined, and from also talking to environmental justice journalists, is that they just don't have the vocabulary or language a lot of times to identify and recognize an environmental justice story and report on it. And partly what you see across both topic areas is there's a lack of accountability. Now, with climate change, they can report on climate change and the science of it and say this extreme weather event is being driven by climate change. When we talk about environmental justice, that's an accountability story. And it's like our broadcast and cable news in this topic area have seeming an aversion to holding someone accountable for doing something to someone else. So when we talk about communities, vulnerable communities, you don't hear about the fossil fuel industry. You don't hear about polluters that are dropping these hazardous products, building, citing these their plants in vulnerable communities. These aren't conversations that you hear about in the media. So, with that being said, the landscape is pretty challenging, but that also just leaves a huge opportunity for them to immediately improve their coverage in substantive ways.
I want to
Thank
ask
you.
a follow-up question. You mentioned that the coverage has decreased. What do you think accounts for that?
It's it's hard. Like there are a lot, like there are a lot of different factors that can drive it. For instance, we saw an uptick in coverage when the president mentions climate change. You'll see. So like in 2022, there were a lot of segments, not necessarily great segments, about the IRA, that mentioned it and mentioned some of its climate provisions. So, that we didn't see a similar kind of topic area. There was also, you see a decent amount of coverage around the COP conferences, but we saw a decrease in that coverage. So, you know, usually we see the most coverage around extreme weather, especially doing, and so when that coverage drops, it can kind of affect the overall coverage. And that was another area where we saw a big drop in coverage in extreme weather events. So it's hard to account for, and to be fair, they cover these extreme weather events. They do a good job of covering the logistics of it, but it's just that climate connection, that accountability piece that's missing from the coverage, and that's what we want to see more of.
Thank you. And for folks who don't know about Media Matters for America work, there's a lot of researchers there, you know, every day studying and doing content analysis on these stories. So they're counting stories, evaluating them, and doing a lot of these analyses. So you can find more of Lando's research on their website. Susan, tell us a little bit more about how it's maybe evolved through a public radio lens. Public radio stations are probably one of the most accessible forms of information because it's not behind a paywall or subscription. Of course, you want people to become members of your station, but they don't have to be in order to get the information.
Exactly. Yeah, no, it's so interesting. I mean, and it's interesting to hear that you said that the coverage has decreased because from my perspective, having started really doing climate coverage maybe 10 years ago, I feel like, oh my God, there's so many more climate reporters than there used to be. And maybe it's because I'm focused on keeping track of what they're all doing that it feels like there's so much more, right, than there used to be. But yeah, it's a good question because you know, when I started out, I was maybe one of, I don't know, maybe there were like half a dozen or a dozen of us across the country at different public media stations that focused on climate. And now I feel like I I can't think of a major public media station that doesn't have a climate team. I mean, obviously NPR has a whole climate team, but like there's we just we had the SEJ conference in Philly recently, and so a lot of the folks from all over the country from public media came, and I was like shocked to see how many stations have climate reporters. So in that respect, I think it's changed a lot. And it's really good to see because it's not easy for these really small, I mean, it's one thing if HYY has climate reporter, but the fact that these really small stations that maybe have 3 reporters or something like actually have people covering climate and the environment is, I think it's a pretty big deal and it's a good thing. um so I feel like in the, at least in the public media space, that has increased big time. And that also, that especially if the younger reporters who are just starting out on beat can tap into NPR's knowledge. Like there's a lot of experienced reporters and editors at NPR that they can go to for advice. Because like you said earlier, Vanessa, like I mean, I think maybe people may be intimidated. Oh, this is kind of technical, maybe, or science or whatever. Like I can't do it, but it's not. That's not true for anything, right? As a reporter, like you just got to dive in and learn because it's your job to learn, right? So, like, I would never want to discourage anyone from doing a climate story if they've never done it before. Like, just go out and talk to people about their experiences. And also, I also find that there's a lot of really good resources out there for people now who are just starting to cover this. And I just want to make a little plug for like Skyline. I don't know if people know about that, but it's an amazing resource. And it's basically like if you're a young reporter or any reporter, right, and you're doing a story and you want an expert on a specific topic, you basically just fill out this form and ask them, and they'll help you get this expert from somewhere. And that kind of thing helps. I think that that helps our reporting a lot, because it's sort of you can kind of combine the scientific expertise that Sciline will give you with your own grassroots reporting, like talking to actual people. What are their experiences? What do they see changing? How did not just these extreme weather events impact them, but like just every day, you know, like the heat waves that are happening this summer. Like at this point, it's just like ridiculous, right? Like it's just, I mean, in my lifetime, I've never seen this many high heat days, right? And that really has an impact on, you know, environmental justice communities who may not have access to air conditioning. I mean, we did a whole series of stories what was it, the first week of summer? I mean, I'm sorry, the first week of school last year, they had to shut down school because there were all these schools that didn't have air conditioning because they're old schools. So they weren't built with air conditioning, It's like whoever thought you would need air conditioning in September. Like, but that's the kind of stories that are out there that are like environmental justice stories. I mean, I just actually saw something in the New York Times too about like public housing and how they're not allowed to have I didn't get I saw the headline. I didn't read the article. I'm sorry. But they're like, there's not a lot of there's not air conditioning in shelters and homeless shelters. I mean, come on. So that's the kind of thing that the sort of everyday stories that we're seeing right now in the sort of climate space. And yes, I agree. Like connect it to climate change, connected to human caused climate change, connected to and hold accountable those who are primarily responsible for human caused climate change, right? And we know who they are, like, just name them, and discuss, and make the link. And, I I do see more people doing that. Although I'm not doing the analysis. So if Aldo like knows more than me, I'm just like looking anecdotally. So I don't know, I didn't I didn't dot my I's or cross my T's there. I don't want to make any leaps of faith, but you would know the data better than me of what people are doing and how they're doing it.
Yeah, so Armando mentioned the need for more accountability journalism, holding the big polluters accountable, the people who are doing the wrongdoers. Um, Meg, do you agree that that's needed in the Delaware River Valley? And what are some of the top stories or issues that you're reporting on as it relates to water issues?
Absolutely. I'll go back to the thing that I was harping on before, which is the reduced newsrooms. As Susan rightly said, NPR is actually fairly muscled up for climate reporting. But when we go back to what I think are the best and most authentic voices for people in EJ communities to listen to or to read, we're talking about, again, ethnic and community media. And then we're talking about reporters who are not climate change reporters, who last night covered the school board and today are covering the flood. And those reporters to become sophisticated enough to be able to connect the dots. It's hard because very often scientists, bless their hearts, they won't say, yes, this flood is caused by climate change. They will often say, this is the type of flood that you might expect, blah, blah, blah. I mean, yes, they're right. God bless them, they're right. But for a new reporter to get that smacking bam, that pay attention to climate change, or otherwise we're going to have more floods, right? Which is really the point of some of these stories. So you have a new reporter, or at least a reporter who's charged with doing a lot of different things, suddenly thrown into a thing that could be climate change. And we're asking him or her with limited time and perhaps limited resources to become really sophisticated. And yes, if they wanted to connect to Sideline, it'd be great. But do they have the time? And this is where I think the organizing folks that we had on before are going to be so critical, because perhaps with the help of the Center for Cooperative Media, they can start identifying the community and ethnic media outlets that they can connect with directly, and then they can help educate those reporters. Now, it may be true that the reporters go through and they only spend a year or two on a small outlet before they go to a larger outfit, but in year or two, that sort of dialogue can really improve that reporter's coverage and really make sense to their local community. From my perspective, my whole focus is water, and the quality of our drinking water, as well as the quantity of our drinking water, is of stupendous importance. The quality of Delaware River water has improved markedly in the last 50 years, but there's still a lot of steps to be taken. The thing that I think I'm more concerned about right now, because the predictions from scientists about how climate change is going to affect this watershed is more water when we have water, less water when we don't. So we're swinging, perhaps, in this neck of the woods between floods and droughts. Floods are one of those things that are incredibly important to a community that's experiencing them. But if you're 20 blocks down the road, you don't really care that much because we're not approaching the issue as a community. And the community that is the watershed needs to understand what it needs to do to perhaps look at its infrastructure, a $1 billion problem that supplies our water system to give us clean water and available water. And we don't end up with water that isn't either safe to drink or water that's just not there to drink.
Thank you. Water is life, right? If we don't have clean water, that'll kill us before we starve. So it's very important to make sure that we have, people monitoring that and informing us about the quality of our water. Evlando, I wanted to ask you about disinformation because it's something Media Matters for America and Free Press has collaborated on trying to combat. What has been the impact of disinformation? And sometimes that comes from lobbyists and special interests on reporting. Last year, when we had this same webinar, it was a concern talked about by many organizers, um, where they said that it was very difficult because there's such a mountain of reporting and information that comes from special interest groups that they're competing with. Have you seen that that's had an influence in media coverage?
Yeah, I can speak to this from two angles. Shout out to my colleague Alana, who is our resident disinformation specialist on our climate team, and you know, she covers a lot of wild conspiracy theories. Lasers were that caused the fire in Hawaii last year, and I think that has one effect, and that effect is kind of flooding the zone with this misinformation, disinformation that just had, like we were talking about, casual reporters, casual readers, casual news consumers. They're just flooded with these kind of nonsense topics and explanations, and they sometimes they don't know who to believe, or they'll just throw their hands up or just say it's all fake. It doesn't make any sense, and so that's one harmful effect, that it kind of pushes out good information at the level that it's being created. The other thing I can speak to, and probably everybody on this call knows about this, is the concerted $1 billion disinformation campaign waged by the fossil fuel industry to undermine climate action. And now they've moved into promoting kind of false solutions, greenwashing. They've also spent a lot of money to individuate the climate crisis to make it a consumer issue instead of a societal issue. And I think that has its own harms. Like you were saying, they have lobbyists and politicians who deny climate change, who ignore the consequences of pollution and hazardous waste. And they do this because it's in their political interest. And I think that has clear material harms on all of us, and particularly vulnerable communities. So, yeah, these disinformation came, and it's weird that we're seeing, for a time there was this kind of, you know, accept climate change, but deny that it's really being as harmful as it is, or climate's always been changing. And now we move right back into outright climate denial, seeing a resurgence. And I think that's just really harmful, and it's kind of institutional in this environment of institutional mistrust and distrust. And I think, good reporters, media outlets have their work cut out kind of cut through that noise and kind of get people the information they need to make informed choices about what our future is going to be.
Yeah, and the reality is that unfortunately, Black and Latinx people are disproportionately targeted by disinformation campaigns. They're also the people, who lack the most access to media and information. And so I think,
Indeed.
the point of working with ethnic media and people that are working with communities of color is really important. I think local media can be the antidote, right? To like good local journalism can be the antidote to disinformation if there's trust there with their local newsroom. And I
Yeah.
think media literacy is also really important because a lot of the disinformation doesn't come necessarily in the form of headlines, but we're seeing it on YouTube and Facebook and TikTok videos. I can't tell you how many videos have been sent to me by aunties, with these conspiracy theories, right? And that the reality is that's where people are getting a lot of their news from these days. So I think it's really important that not only that we do good journalism around these issues, but we're continuing to teach people how to evaluate fact from fiction and to evaluate the sources and knowing whether it's coming from a lobbyist or corporation, or if it's coming from legitimate fact check sources.
And can I make one brief point? Just echoing strongly what Meg said. Um, I was at SEJ as well, Susan, and we had a really good panel about environmental justice journalism as well. And the key point that came out of that was at the local level with media that communities of color trust, reaching out to them, being proactive, and reaching out to them and getting them the information and resources they need to report to their communities. And I just want to strongly echo that. I feel like this is a growing movement, and hopefully we'll see some action on it very soon to build that trust and to kind of counteract a lot of disinformation that's being targeted at these communities. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where collaboration is key and sharing information and kind of sorting through these things together is really important. Susan, can you tell us about an environmental story that you've covered that highlighted an injustice or harmful policy or negative impact in the community? And did anything happen as a result of your reporting?
Yeah, everyone wants something to happen. And it's so weird. The stories that you think something's going to happen, like nothing happens, and the ones that you think are going to be sleepers, something happens. I don't know if that's everyone's experience, but that's certainly been um my experience. But yeah, so a couple things. One of the things that I've kind of been reporting on off and on is this whole issue with PGW because Philadelphia owns a gas company, which is very strange. It's a very strange situation, right? It's really hard to report on because although it's a municipally owned company, it's not transparent at all. And but there is this really interesting kind of grassroots environmental justice movement sort of pushing the company to um, transition away from fossil fuels to like a more sustainable or renewable future. And you know, so there's been a couple of stories I've done about that and what PGW is doing. And there was one story, for instance, where and getting information out of PGW is so hard with like right to knows and stuff, but I did manage to get some information with the help of this other organization that was just really good at helping me sort through all this disinformation. And I found out that that PGW, which is a Philadelphia-owned gas company, was lobbying the state legislature um, for a bill that would have sort of hamstrung the cities, like it would have like it could have prevented the city from enacting its own climate goals, right? So on the one hand, you have this city that's like, okay, we got these climate goals, and this is what we want to do, and then on the other hand, they have this like gas company that's going behind the scenes and trying to get law passed in Harrisburg that would completely hamper the city from enacting its climate goals. It was there were so many complications to it, but at the end of the day, I think I the guy that was doing the lobbying suddenly disappeared. He doesn't work for them anymore. There was a lot of sort of information, like the fact that people had that information allowed them to sort of try to hold the company accountable through city council hearings and whatnot. Um, so, that's the kind of story that's kind of like hard. It's nuts and bolts. It's like you're spending a lot of time going through documents and trying to figure out what this all means and what it says and doesn't say what you think it says. And it's 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 that hard kind of reporting that's all behind the scenes. But sometimes once you finally do put the story out there, it can have an impact. And the grassroots movement that was working to change PGW was doing that before my story, no doubt about it. But it kind of gave them a little bit more information, like more transparency about what this company was doing. And so um they're still sort of beating back, and beating back this this brick wall of like this company that is just refusing to change and refusing to recognize the future of climate change. But I'm sort of rambling right now. But that's the story I can think of that had the most impact recently, that I know of, right? But we have lots of stories that have an impact, that you do, that even if it's something, um, like you mentioned the spill in the Delaware River, right? You know, we covered that. We did a lot of reporting about that. And just the weird communication from the city, the confusing communication from the city. Yes, exactly. And we did some stories about like, okay, what was the communication all in English? Like what happened with people who didn't speak English? Did they know that their drinking water was at risk? So yeah, I mean there's, like I said, there's all those story, you want all your story to have that kind of impact, but it doesn't necessarily happen, but that's okay because it's like a body of work. And when you talk about trust, like you were talking about trust earlier, and that's like so key to have. I mean, I think that's one thing that public radio does have with our audience is trust. Um, but I think also, like Meg said earlier, um, the very local, the very hyper local ethnic press has, I think, probably a high level of trust with their audience, and so it's a very useful like format to do those kind of accountability stories, do the sort of news you can use stories, about what's happening with your water. If there's a spill today, actually, I don't know if you saw that. So there's another spill, some chemical spill in the Schuylkill River. We have a reporter on that now. um you know this DEP knew about this in April. Like, why didn't anyone tell anybody this? Like, what is happening? Like, why is this coming out now? Why are we just learning that like Bartram's Gardens Trail is shut down today, even though DEP apparently knew this in April? Like, what is happening? So, yeah, I mean, those are the kind of stories I think that are really useful that people want to hear about because they're like, wait, I walk along that trail, and they want to hear, like, is that going to impact my water? Well, no, because that's below the water intake. So there's really important information you can give your readers and listeners, like, okay, your drinking water may be okay, but don't go kayaking in the river right now. We don't know what this chemical, what this chemical can do or what it's going to do. So that's those kind of stories where it might not be like, okay, there's this government investigation, but it's still a very useful story, right? It's still a very useful story to your community, to your listeners and your readers. And it also is a story that helps like kind of establish trust with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to continue on that thread. And this is one of the questions in our poll, which is, how do you think journalists can better report on climate and environmental issues? And we're asking them what they need. But I wanted to ask all of you as we wrap up this panel, because the media plays such a big role in shaping public discourse around climate issues, what do you think is needed to do more effective journalism? And especially, with impacted communities and communities of color in mind, because that was a big call from the previous panel, is that these issues are not reported enough, for the communities that are most affected by these issues. Evanda, we'll start with you. Final thoughts on that?
Sure, and I'll be quick because we've wrote about them and I have them ready to go. One, applying environment. We want to apply connect climate change, connect extreme weather to climate change, amplify voices from impacted communities and local activists, provide real context, don't just mention demographics, explain the systemic issues driving climate and environmental inequalities, connect the dots, show how individual events tie into a bigger picture of climate injustice or environmental injustice, and hold power accountable, challenge the industries and policymakers responsible for environmental harms. And these are just a few ways that we think that news media outlets, particularly broadcast and cable, can immediately improve their reporting on climate change and environmental justice. Thank you.
Meg?
I'm going to repeat what I said before. Collaboration, I think, is the key. If we can get legacy newsrooms like WHYY and the Philadelphia Inquirer to allow local media, small sources, to be able to republish their stories, and also if those legacy media outlets would welcome stories from legacy media and have more conversation from the big and the little, shall I say, that's one way. The collaboration I talked about before, like whatever the small ethnic media, ethnic or community media is in a particular part of the Jersey ecosystem, they can sort of start talking to each other about the problems they're seeing and what they can do to hire perhaps maybe a freelancer to do a story once in a while. Then they can connect that freelancer to the voices from the community represented by some of the people we had on the previous panel. So it's a question of working together and educating each other and getting whatever information we have as freely available as possible. I mean, I know that our incomes and salaries depend sometimes on paywalls. Delaware Currents doesn't have a paywall. Anything that's in Delaware Currents, anybody can publish. And I think that somehow engendering that this is too important to be held up by paywalls. It's just incredibly important.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, during the public health COVID-19 crisis, that was a time when they lifted paywalls. So they've proven that they can do it, even if it is on just certain particular issues. But I think it's a point well taken because that was vital information. And Stephen, what can we do to do better climate reporting and, more effective journalism on these issues? I know you already mentioned a few things, but if there's anything else you have to add.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything Londo and Meg said. You know, I think I think as any reporter would tell you who's been on a beat for a while, like just start doing it and then you'll get better, right? I mean, you will get better because like people will email you, at least for me. I mean, people are very quick to tell me what I've done wrong. Um, so they'll email you, they'll comment, and you know, you just kind of get better at it the more you do it. It's a craft that you learn over time. But also like, overall, generally, how do we get better? I mean, I would just repeat what the my colleagues on the panel have said. You know what I mean? Like those points are very well taken. And you do forget sometimes, and maybe like sometimes I'll put just like little things like, and I put it at my desk to remind me, but maybe I should put something like accountability or whatever. Because even like a regular story about high heat, like, oh, it's heat today. Oh, this is how this person is adapting, and this is how this person is doing. And this, you go out and you talk to like the construction worker who's got to work, and this person, you can still put something. You can still put a couple sentences in there about accountability, about linking it. There is this, new science called attribution science that sort of looks at whether this particular event, whether it's high heat or hurricane, whether they can be connected to that particular event can be connected to climate change. But you can also just generally say, like, climate scientists are telling us that this was the prediction. We're going to get hotter. We're going to get wetter. We're going to have more floods, and this is connected to climate. Climate is connected to us burning fossil fuels. Um, and that's something that we can just all do every day, just through like one or two sentences in our stories.
Thank you so much, all of you.